Okay, hi everybody. Here's our second recorded lecture. As we kind of started to discuss the last class, the beginning of the Cold War and the intensification of the Cold War, we saw how Europe becomes divided kind of ideologically, how this struggle spreads to East Asia with China and Korea, and how the armed struggle between the United States and the Soviet Union somewhat stabilizes because of the advent of nuclear weapons and intercontinental ballistic missiles, leading to this idea of mutually assured destruction. Now, as we also looked at the very end of that class, mutually assured destruction doesn't mean that the Cold War is not going to be violent. It just means that the Cold War is not going to involve fighting directly between the United States and the Soviet Union. And so today we're going to turn our attention to the rest of the world. As you probably remember, much of Africa and many parts of Asia had been incorporated into these various European empires. And after World War II, these empires are in deep trouble. So that's what we're going to look at today. Now, the key questions for today are: what factors dictated whether decolonization was a peaceful or a violent process? What were the different approaches taken to decolonization? And how did decolonization become wrapped up in Cold War politics? Now, as you can see from this map, much of Africa and huge parts of Asia remained part of one or another European empire after World War II. We talked about during the Second World War how the Japanese humiliated the French and the Dutch and the British, but when the war ended, the thought process amongst Europeans, at least, was that these empires would continue. Now, the question, however, was that in this new Cold War reality of, the West being kind of dominated by the United States and the East being dominated by the Soviet Union, where would these empires fit? They don't really fit terribly comfortably in this dynamic, right? This is in large part because, at least in theory, both the United States and the Soviet Union were anti-imperialist powers. Both embraced ideologies that called for freedom for oppressed people. Both viewed the British, French, and other European empires as kind of vestiges of some bygone era. And so it therefore appeared that the end of empire had come. But just how was this going to take place? Would it be violent? Would it be peaceful? Would it happen immediately? Or would it happen over time? And an added complication to this was the fact that one imperial power, Britain, had actually won the war. They didn't lose. So why would they want to give up their empire? In fact, the British considered themselves to be a great power equal to the United States and the Soviet Union because of their empire. So why would they want to get rid of it? Other powers, such as France and the Netherlands, were trying to reassert their independence after the war, reassert themselves after being defeated by the Germans during the war. And the idea of giving up their empire right after this kind of humiliating defeat only seemed to add to that humiliation, and thus they too wanted to hold on to their empires. Now, of course, as we're going to see, the colonial people have a voice in all of this. And this entire process that becomes known as decolonization, the ending of empire, doesn't happen in a political vacuum. Cold War politics become intimately involved in this whole process of decolonization. Many of the liberation groups, the freedom fighters that fight against these European empires, take hold of Marxist communism as a tool to fight the oppression of the quote-unquote capitalist West. Therefore, what were in essence national liberation struggles get kind of sucked into this Cold War dynamic and take on broader geostrategic implications for the bigger Cold War picture. So this process of ending empire gets intimately involved in this broader division of the world into pro-American capitalists and pro-communist Soviet side, right? Now, this process actually gets started during the war. As we kind of highlighted, Japanese victories in the Southeast Asia and other places had kind of inspired the rise of an invigoration of nationalist movements throughout the region. The Japanese were initially welcomed as liberators, and after they became brutal rulers as well, were resisted with the same kind of vigor that the British, French, and others had been resisted. Now, interestingly, as we already highlighted, the British and Americans and others trained guerrilla groups to fight the Japanese in places like Burma, in places like Malaysia, Indonesia, the Philippines, and elsewhere. These same kind of groups that had fought the Japanese were now armed, were now trained, skilled warriors, skilled guerrillas with effective leaders. These groups are not going to be very happy about the British, French, and Dutch and others coming strolling back in at the end of the war. Most of them believed that they deserved some kind of recognition for what they had done, if nothing else. Now, this kind of division of expectations between these liberation fighters, these guerrillas who had fought the Japanese, who expected to be given independence or autonomy or some kind of freedom for in return for their service, in return for their efforts to fight the Japanese. These kind of expectations are going to bump into the expectations of the Europeans, who see the empires as a vital aspect of their rebuilding at the end of the war. They need the resources of their empires, they need the wealth of their empires to rebuild. And besides, especially for the British, they invested a lot of money and blood and treasure to win back these territories from the Japanese. So to give it right up after the war seems pretty unthinkable. Britain still considered itself to be a major power, as I said, and it believed in the empire. The French and the Dutch were in some ways in even worse shape than the British. They needed their empires even more. Besides, they wanted to make up for the humiliation that they felt. So they were also going to try to reimpose their authority. Now, how you approach this is a different question. Are you going to fight to take back these territories? Are you going to negotiate? Are you going to give up certain territories? Well, that becomes a question for the different Europeans. And for the British, in a sense, perhaps this kind of psychological burden that the Dutch and the French have, that the British don't, gives the British an advantage. They do not feel this kind of psychological need to re-control all these territories. And in essence, the British become much more pragmatic about the end of empire. They want to keep the empire, but they want to keep the empire so that it will be a source of strength for them. You don't get strength from the empire if you have to fight long wars with insurgents and guerrillas all over the place. So the British are going to engage in kind of a cost-benefit analysis. If it is beneficial to keep a colony or a territory, the British will. If it ends up being more trouble than it's worth, the British are much more willing to let it go. The French and the Dutch, however, are going to take a slightly different view. They are going to fight to take back these territories, even if it means long, protracted wars. They're going to employ brutal, efforts to retake their colonies, and they're also going to see a heavy dose of Cold War geopolitics injected into their struggles. It just so happens that the French effort to retake Vietnam is going to mean that they're going to be pitted against Vietnamese communists. Communists are no friend of the United States. And the same thing's going to happen for the Dutch in Indonesia. So we have this process in which we have this kind of fight or flight decision on the part of the Europeans. Do you fight for the colonies or do you leave? And added to this is a kind of an extra awkward situation in some places. In some parts of these empires, you actually have quite sizable white European populations that live there, which make this decision-making process even more complex. Places like South Africa that have a large white minority that dominates the country. Places like Kenya that have a large white minority. And places like Algeria for the French, where a large French minority lives there, and the country of Algeria is considered part of France. So decision making, as you can see, is quite complex. So let's go look at a couple examples of how this works. The first example that I want to look at is the situation in India. India had been a huge participant in the Second World War. During the conflict, they had contributed a great deal to the war effort. But this had actually caused many Indians to desire not just autonomy in the British Empire, but complete and total independence. First of all, the British Viceroy, this governor of India, had declared war in India's name without asking the Indian people. To placate India, Britain had paid for the use of its army and had paid India money during the war, actually ending up in India's debt at the end of the war. But even so, Indian leaders were pretty upset and pretty offended by British attitudes during the war. During the actual conflict, Mohandas Gandhi began to lead a non-violent protest movement called the Quit India movement, trying to force the British out of India. And in fact, he was thrown into jail by the British in 1942. Now, these protests continue, and they continue even after the war. A moderate plan put forward by the British to kind of offer the Indians self-government within the British Empire was rejected. And the British are growing increasingly worried about this situation. Remember, the British want to hold on to the empire, but only if it benefits them. In 1946, a mutiny breaks out amongst the Indian Navy. And the Indian Navy is not very big, but this is terrifying for the British, because what happens if a mutiny breaks out in the Indian Army, this huge military force? The British realize that the situation is deteriorating quickly, and the decision-making in Britain moves fast. They decide, we have to get out of India. They appoint a new viceroy, Lord Mountbatten, in 1946 to make a decision about getting out of India. Mountbatten arrives. He's actually related to the royal family. He's a very prestigious guy, and he assesses the situation. Now, here's the problem, right? What does it mean to give independence to India? Do you give independence to the entire Indian Raj? Do you give independence to parts of it? How does this work? Well, an added complication is that Gandhi and others like him want one unified India. Now, why might this be a problem for some people? Well, India is divided ethnically and religiously. Many Indians, in fact the majority of Indians, are Hindu, but sizable portions of the population are Muslim, Sikh, and other religions. Now, the Muslims, led by a guy named Muhammad Ali Jinnah, are quite concerned about ending up in a unified India that's going to be dominated by Hindus. You know, the Muslims will never be able to win a democratic election when they're so outnumbered by Hindus. And despite the fact that Gandhi and his political partner Nehru argue that India will be a true democracy, people's rights will be protected, and all sorts of things, the Muslims are quite concerned about this. Well, Mountbatten runs into this problem. He wants to give independence to India, but the Indians can't decide on whether they want independence this way or that way or any other way. Thus, Mountbatten finally makes the decision. He decides that he's going to give independence to two different countries. India for the Hindus and Pakistan for the Muslims. But now the matter becomes, how do you make two countries out of one? The partition that Britain decides upon sees a lawyer from London arrive in India and literally draw a line on a big map using demographic data. He creates two countries, India and Pakistan, which are both given their independence in August of 1947. Now the problem is that a lot of Hindus now live in Muslim Pakistan, and a lot of Muslims now live in Hindu India. And as you can probably imagine, in the chaos of this situation, mass violence breaks out against ethnic and religious minorities. The partition of India results in a huge movement of people. Hindus leaving the new Pakistan, Muslims leaving the new India. Somewhere between 500,000 and 1.5 million die in this process. But the British get out, and they get out in the nick of time. And they consider this to be a success in decolonization. Here's a map of the two countries. As you'll see, East and West Pakistan come into existence at this time. Eventually, East Pakistan becomes the country of Bangladesh. Now, if we choose to run away in India, there are a couple other examples of where the British choose to fight. Kenya is a good example of this. Kenya has a large white minority of British, descended people who live there. The idea of abandoning these people to an independent Kenya dominated by African Kenyans is kind of unthinkable to the British. And this is especially the case when an ethnic group known as the Kikuyu began a rebellion against the British in the early 1950s. British farmers have stolen all of the best land in Kenya, and these rebels, who become known as Mau Mau, begin attacking British-held farms and murdering their inhabitants. In response to this, the British actually send in military forces and fight a quite brutal civil war against these Mau Mau. Other Kenyans join the British in fighting them as well. The British use concentration camps and many other brutal tactics to crush the Mau Mau, to break the back of this rebellion. Now, they learn some valuable lessons fighting the Mau Mau and fighting a counterinsurgency campaign, and they transfer these lessons to another colonial war that they're desperate to win. This war takes place in what we would today call Malaysia. Malaya, as it was known at that time, was an extremely valuable colony for the British. And ethnic Chinese Malayans took up an armed insurgency against the British following the war to try to drive them out. The British, allied with other ethnic groups in the territory, fought a long 10-year counterinsurgency war against these rebels, who also happened to be communist. Because they were communist, the United States actually assisted the British in this war, sending military advisors to both learn how to fight jungle counterinsurgency warfare and also to develop new tactics. Now, if you look at this photograph, if I hadn't told you that this was from the Malayan emergency, you may have assumed that this was a picture from the Vietnam War. And this is no mistake. Malaya is fairly close to Vietnam, and many of these American advisors that are participating in helping the British put down communists in Malaya will be transferred to Vietnam in just a few years. Now, if the British are willing to fight in these places, there's a couple other examples of where the British simply want to get out before things get too complex. And the Middle East is a complex example of this, where the British have places where interests are very important and where interests are quite problematic. And unfortunately for them, these two things intersect quite a lot. Palestine is a great example of where the British are stuck in a place that has no strategic value for them and is nothing but a headache. If you remember, they've promised Palestine to both the Arabs and the Jews. And after the horrors of the Holocaust, you could probably understand why many Jewish refugees from Europe want to come to Palestine. They want to come to a land where they can be protected, where Jews can live together and defend themselves. Well, this is all well and good for the Jews, but for the British, this creates a massive headache because the local Arab population, while welcoming and accommodating to many of these Jews, obviously do not want to become outnumbered and lose their land. There's really no way to actually solve this situation in a way that will make everyone happy. And the British turn it over in 1947 to the new United Nations, which was created after the end of the Second World War. The United Nations tries to create a partition plan, which you can see here in the middle, which is going to give part of Palestine to Jews and part of Palestine to Arabs. But this is not satisfactory to either side, and war erupts in 1948. By the end of the war, the now Israeli population has actually won way more territory than they were going to be given by the United Nations, but in the process has created a huge refugee problem, creating about 500,000 Palestinian refugees. Now, for our story today, this is especially important because despite the fact that they withdraw and give over authority to the United Nations, many other Arab states blame Britain for this fiasco, what they view as a fiasco. Actually, the British, I forgot to mention this, the British actually, part of the reason they leave is because Jewish groups wage a campaign against British soldiers, assassinating and killing British soldiers, including bombing this hotel. The British have no interest in staying and get out without really covering themselves in much glory. Now, this kind of wave of nationalism that begins to emerge at the end of this conflict in Palestine sees Arabs begun to kind of coalesce around ideas of kind of Arab statehood, Arab nationhood, and a desire to kick out the imperialists. Well, another interesting example of this type of nationalism takes place in another part of the Middle East, in Iran. Iran is not an Arab country, but the same kind of feelings of nationalism are starting to emerge there as well, particularly against Britain. Britain doesn't really control Iran per se, but they dominate the most important industry in Iran, oil. In 1951, this man, Mohammad Mossadegh, is actually elected, democratically elected, to be the prime minister of Iran on a platform that he will take back control of Iran's oil and therefore truly win the independence of the country away from Britain. He nationalizes the holdings of an oil company known as the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company, what today we call BP, or British Petroleum, and declares a massive triumph for the Iranians. They've taken back control of this oil. Well, the British, for their part, do not want to allow this to happen. Obviously, losing a huge asset like that is a big deal. And besides, if you let the Iranians get away with this, what will other countries around the world do to British assets? They'll take them back as well, right? So the British actually blacklist this oil from Iran. They refuse to allow any British company and get the Americans on board as well. No one will buy Iranian oil. Well, as the situation in Iran gets worse because no one's buying their oil, Mossadegh becomes increasingly isolated. He's forced to look to other political parties for support, and he makes a fatal mistake when he turns to a party in Iran which is known to have communist leanings for their support. When he turns to these communists, the United States gets incredibly suspicious of Mossadegh. And in 1953, with British help, the Central Intelligence Agency, the CIA, overthrows the democratic government of Iran and installs the old king, the Shah, as a dictator to rule Iran and to keep the oil flowing. Now, this is going to obviously have huge ramifications for the entire region. But this kind of nationalism and pushback has another example in the region, which is equally important for our class. In Egypt, in 1952, nationalists take power as well, under the leadership of this man, Gamal Abdel Nasser. He's on the right here. Nasser preaches a message of pan-Arab nationalism. He wants to create a unified Arab state based on kind of Arab nationalism that will get rid of all of these European imperialists. Now, Nasser's kind of message of Arab unity inspires Arabs around the Middle East to resist European imperialism. Perhaps the most important example of this is Algeria, which begins to wage a campaign against France for its independence. France considers Algeria to be part of their country, to be part of France. And this results in quite a vicious civil war in Algeria between Arab Algerians and white French, who both consider Algeria to be their home. The kind of fighting, it's very brutal, a lot of terrorist attacks, a lot of torture on the part of French security forces, and it gets quite ugly. Now, the French suspect that the Algerians are getting support from Nasser, and the British themselves are getting quite concerned with this guy who's whipping up anti-British sentiment all throughout the Middle East, including in other important regions like Kuwait and the United Arab Emirates and other places such as that. Now, the British and French therefore deem that Nasser has got to go, that we've got to get rid of this guy, right? Well, this might have worked back in the good old days of empire, but things are beginning to change, right? Well, the British and the French decide to come up with a secret plan to get rid of Nasser, and they employ the one other country in the Middle East that doesn't like Nasser, and that is Israel. They make a secret plan that in 1956, Nasser is going to be toppled by a combined British, French, and Israeli assault. Well, what sparks all of this? What sparks all of this is that Nasser has been trying to play both sides of the Cold War off against each other. And to get the money he needs to develop the country in the way he wants, he nationalizes the Suez Canal in 1956. Well, this springs the entire British and French and Israeli plan into action. What's going to happen is the Israelis will invade Egypt. They'll invade through the Sinai Peninsula and threaten the Suez Canal. Britain and France will act like peacemakers. They will bring a proposal to the United Nations for peace, to kind of a ceasefire to end this fighting. But they'll do it in such a way that the Egyptians will be forced to reject it. Then the British and the French will be able to point their finger at Nasser and say that he is the villain, he is the guy that wants the war, and they will invade the Suez Canal zone to defend it from chaos. In the process, Nasser will be toppled, everything will work out just fine. Well, that's the plan. And that's exactly what happens at first, at least. The Israelis invade, the British and the French propose their thing to the United Nations. When the Egyptians reject it, British and French troops invade the Suez Canal zone and conquer it, take it back. But the problem is that nobody else in the entire world believes any of this. The British and the French have been moving their troops towards the Suez Canal zone even before the crisis begins. Everybody sees right through this, including the Soviet Union and the United States. The United States is absolutely furious about this, and they withdraw all of their economic support for Britain and France until they agree to withdraw their troops. They do after several weeks, and it's utterly humiliating for the British and the French. The Suez Crisis, as it comes to be known, is kind of, in retrospect, a turning point in terms of empire, at least for the British. The British recognize after the Suez Crisis in 1956 that they are not going to be able to rebuild their empire in the way that they had initially hoped. They recognize that the age of empire is more or less over, and that they will have to switch towards rapidly ending their empire in as responsible a way as possible and in a way that will allow them to keep some influence. It's quite amazing. Within 10 years of this Suez Crisis, most of the British Empire will be independent and free. Now, the reason that the United States was quite upset about Britain and France's actions in Suez was that this question of independence and freedom for the empires was getting wrapped up more and more in this Cold War kind of dichotomy. The Soviets and their allies could quite rightly point to the West and say these are imperialist powers. Britain and France are imperialist. And the Americans are having a hard time defending their allies, right? This is a charge that's hard to kind of refute. And so what the United States wants from their allies is, where possible, they want them to give their colonies independence. They want to have them give colonies independence to responsible, democratic, capitalist governments, right? Well, this isn't always possible, however. The United States does recognize that some of these places, if given their independence, will become communist. And so the Americans begin to see this decolonization process through this lens. Where you can give independence to Democrats and capitalists, do it. Where communists will take over, fight like hell. But the problem is that this is sometimes easier said than done, because many of these people fighting for freedom don't really fit into this nice, neat category of either being capitalist or communist, pro-America or pro-Soviet. In fact, many of the freedom fighters fall somewhere in between. And this is not very comfortable for the superpowers, particularly the United States. They want to be able to view all of this as quite simple, black and white, right and wrong. Well, this makes things a little awkward. A good example of this is Fidel Castro. When Castro takes power in Cuba in 1959, he is not a communist. He is certainly left-wing. He is certainly a socialist of some sort, but he's not pro-Soviet. He's not pro-communist. But the Americans get increasingly nervous about this guy, and in 1961 they order a failed invasion of Cuba by Cuban dissidents known as the Bay of Pigs invasion. And when Castro and his troops defeat this invasion, Castro turns to the Soviets and becomes their ally. We talked about this last class with the Cuban Missile Crisis. So you can see how someone who starts off kind of in the middle, in between these two camps, is driven into one camp by the actions of the other. Another good example of this is Vietnam. Ho Chi Minh, the leader of the Vietnamese communists, has fought the Japanese during the war, and after the war fights a long war against the French for independence. When he declares the independence of Vietnam in 1946, he does so by reading the American Declaration of Independence. And why does he do that? Well, he does that to try to show the world that what he wants for Vietnam is not to become part of this global Soviet communist conspiracy. He wants Vietnam to be free and independent, to choose its own course, just like America did in 1776. Well, it doesn't work. The Americans view Ho Chi Minh not as a freedom fighter, they view him as a communist and an agent of the broader communist world. And thus they actually aid France, in fighting against Ho Chi Minh's forces for several years until the French are ultimately defeated in 1954. After the French defeat, the Americans still refuse to acknowledge Ho Chi Minh, and they negotiate a peace treaty that divides Vietnam into a communist north, controlled by Ho Chi Minh, and a democratic capitalist south. Well, kind of democratic capitalist south that will be defended by the United States. And as we'll see, this is going to be quite complex. Now, the mixing of decolonization and Cold War politics has actually caused some historians to rename this the global Cold War. While the Cold War in Europe, as we saw, and even in Asia after the Korean War was over, didn't really claim very many lives, it's going to end up costing millions of lives in what's becoming known as the Third World, this world of the South, Africa, and southern parts of Asia. Now, much of the reason that the Third World is still desperately poor to this very day has to do with this legacy. But this war between communism and anti-communism wasn't the only way forward. As I mentioned, Britain, after the Suez Crisis, realizes that the age of trying to cling to empire, the age of trying to rule in the old way, is basically over. If Britain wants to maintain its role in its former empire, it's going to have to do so in a different way. They kind of come up with one of the great ideological rebrandings in history. They changed the name of the empire to the British Commonwealth. They give this idea that all of these countries in the British Empire, the whole point of the empire has been, all along, they claim, to lead these countries to independence, to get them to the point where they can govern themselves. And the idea of the Commonwealth is that all of these countries will become free, but they will remain and maintain some kind of partnership and relationship to Britain and to each other, kind of this big British happy family, right? Well, this is kind of ridiculous in a lot of ways, but it works to a certain extent. The British are able to transition many of these countries quite quickly to independence. They try to recognize and focus on nationalist leaders who are acceptable to the Americans and to themselves, nationalist leaders who are not communists, and to kind of put them in position to assume power as quickly as possible. The first example of this is actually in 1957-58, so almost immediately after the Suez Crisis. They give power to Ghana, they give independence to Ghana to Kwame Nkrumah, who becomes the first leader of a free democratic Ghana. And this kind of continues year after year after year. British royal family members get quite used to flying to some place in Africa, lowering the Union Jack flag, raising the flag of the newly independent country, saluting, singing some songs, shaking some hands, and getting back on the airplane. Almost every year from the late 50s into the mid to late 60s, some part of Africa or some part of Asia is getting independence from Britain. And this is not going to work perfectly, but to a certain extent, it does show that when the British decide to end the empire, they are more or less able to get themselves out quickly. Now, many of these countries end up in very bad situations, which we'll talk about more in the future. But at the time, in the 1960s, this seems like a remarkable achievement. Now, one place where this doesn't go so well, however, is South Africa. South Africa is basically independent by this point, ruled by a white minority. So the British don't really have much authority there any longer. But the British get up on their high horse. Now that they've decided that the empire needs to end, they decide that this is actually quite crucial. The British now view ending the empire peacefully, democratically, and quickly as a key aspect of the Cold War. If you don't want these countries to become communist, you must give them freedom. That's kind of the idea. Well, in South Africa, where you have this small white minority ruling over the vast black majority, this is kind of a recipe for communist insurgency, right? And so, in 1961, the British Prime Minister, Harold Macmillan, flies to South Africa, and he gives a very famous speech. In this speech, he tells this room full of white legislators that the winds of change are blowing through Africa, and that if you do not stay on the right side of these winds, they will blow you away. This idea that history is moving towards freedom and democracy in Africa, and these white legislators in South Africa need to make sure that they're on the same side of history, the right side of history. Well, as you can imagine, these white minority rulers of South Africa resist this call. They reject Macmillan's interference, and they continue to abide by their system of segregation called apartheid. And Macmillan's warning is fairly prescient, because this resistance on the part of these white minority regimes to give over power peacefully does lead to violence in South Africa. Previously peaceful leaders such as Nelson Mandela, a peaceful lawyer leading the African National Congress, a kind of pro-majority movement, does turn to violence and does get increasingly radicalized. They never quite become communist, but they become radicalized. Now, Nelson Mandela is arrested and put on trial. In fact, he's locked away for 26 years. But the message that the British put out there is kind of a wise one, that this process of decolonization, this process of ending empire, is now intimately connected to the Cold War. If you don't give power peacefully, you run the risk of having to give power to communists through violence. And as we're going to see, unfortunately, the United States isn't going to learn this lesson very well until it learns it the hard way. And that's what we'll talk about when I get back. All right, thanks, guys. I'll see you on Friday.